So I'm talking about state space models and how they are a unifying modeling approach in statistical ecology. But I want to also, I wanted to give this talk to communicate the generality of state space models to areas beyond statistical ecology. In fact, that, for example, there's a lot of potential applications in agricultural science as well. So give a brief introduction to what state space models are, then talk about three specific formulations, not the fitting of the results, but just the formulation of three different state space models on three very different statistical ecology scenarios. Then talk briefly about different ways of fitting state space models, then give a concrete example where fitting a state space model had quite an impact, and then some conclusions. So first of all, state space models are models for when you have two time series that are running in parallel. So one time series, which you can't see it directly, or you can only see it partially, is what we call the state process time series. And so that is the underlying truth, the underlying dynamics, what's really going on in nature. Then the observation time series parallels that state process time series, and it consists of measurements on the state process. So what we're imagining here is that we start at time zero with some initial state, and that state evolves in time. And sequentially, we're making measurements, imperfect measurements on those states. Okay, so another picture of this is, so I'm letting Z represent the value of the state, the unobserved state, and Y are the observations. And then here's a picture of what these two processes look like in parallel, where the blue dots are observations, the red dots are real values. So this is simulated data. And then the black line that's running across here, that's the fit. That's the estimates of the states given the observations. So that's the kind of data that a state space model attempts to fit. Okay, so mathematically, we have two time series models here. One, this top one, is the observation model, where it's connecting the observations y of t to the states z of t, and then some unknown parameters psi. So that describes the relationship between observations and the state. And then the state model is generally a first order Markov type model, where it says that's the state at time t is a function of the state at time t minus 1, and then some unknown parameters. So this G function, this is a probability density or probability mass function that's characterizing the dynamics in nature. Whereas the F probability density is characterizing sampling variation or sampling uncertainty. Now, the reason that state space models are popular is that they have this ability to separate out natural process variation from observation error. So here's a very simple example of a state space model, what's called a linear Gaussian state space model. And these are the oldest kinds of state space models. They've been around since about 1960. And here, the relationships between observations and states is this normal distribution. And then the states evolve according to our normal distribution as well. And here I've got sigma squared p for process variation and sigma squared o for observation error. And these models, the state space model separates these two things out, these two kinds of uncertainty. So another reason for the popularity and the power of state space modeling is they have this sort of built-in divide and conquer nature to them, where you can work, statisticians can work with subject matter specialists, with scientists who can focus very closely just on the mechanisms, the underlying true natural processes, while the statisticians can just focus on, say, how the data was collected, or what kind of sampling error, what kind of measurement error was there. So there's a nice division of duties, although once you start working with people, there's a lot of overlap as well. Now, a lot of people have heard of hidden Markov models, and hidden Markov models are a special case of state space models. What makes them distinct here is that they have just a finite number of possible states, and so these states are either discrete or categorical values. So a very simple case would be a plant is infected or not, and how does its infection status change over time? Or if you're looking at modeling seals and their movement, are they resting, are they foraging, are they migrating? So the point here is that there's a finite number of possible state values. So in a sense, it's a simpler model. So state space models and hidden Markov models together are special cases of what are called hierarchical models. And a lot of you have probably heard of, say, random effects models before, or multi-level models. Those are all different types of hierarchical models. And so you can add another layer to the state space model by allowing the process parameters to vary in time here. So this third row here, this is talking about how the parameters are changing over time due to changes in the environment. So theta t here is the vector of parameters that are controlling how the state evolves, but they themselves are affected by what's going on in nature. Now, another thing that's handy with this hierarchical structure is that it's amenable to doing data fusion, where you would bring in multiple sets of observations. So here I've given an example of where there's two observation models, one for, say, y of 1, which is measuring one aspect of the state, and y of 2 is measuring some other aspect of the state. So they lend themselves to bringing in multiple data sources. Now, talk a little bit about some of the applications in ecology. First of all, time series data are found a lot in ecology. If you were to Google status and trends, you'd find worldwide that there's hundreds of long-term monitoring programs for fish and wildlife and plant populations. There's also information that comes in from the sequential harvest of fish and wildlife as well. Then, in terms of like animal movement, like what Adam was talking about earlier, there's increasing volume of geolocation data on individual animals. Then there's also a lot of information that comes in from vegetation plots, say by different forestry organizations, where they've gone back year after year and they're taking measurements on the plants and the trees and so on. Now, state space models have in the last probably 10, 15 years become the default approach for modeling population dynamics, and also the default approach for modeling the animal movement, given really by increases in the amount of measuring devices like radio collars and GPS, acoustic tags, and so on that are creating these massive data sets. And state space models give you a way to coherently use those multiple types of data. Just some pictures here of different animals that have been modeled. Their dynamics have been modeled with state space models: polar bears, small smelt, desert owls, and mongoose. Some of the output, here's a particular problem I worked on where we modeled the dynamics of Chinook salmon populations, and we had 4 different states, and these are different age classes of the salmon. So we had, I'll show on the next page here, we have, well, this is the underlying dynamics. So the subject matter specialist focused on this part right here. So this is how the population evolves in time in terms of spawning and surviving and movement and so on. Then we had data coming from 3 different sources here. So this was one of these data fusion examples. So we had 3 different observation processes that were measuring the fish at different life stages in different areas. And then at the top here, this was the state process. This is that graph on the previous page that's translated into an equation form. Another example, like I said, movement modeling uses state space models a lot. Here's an example of data coming from, I think it was Argos tags and GPS tags on the movements of a single polar bear. across time. And this is an example where the states consisted of the longitude and latitude of the polar bear. And so it was notions about turning angles and sort of step size, step rate. And then the observations were coming from Argos data. This is a very recent application, state space models, in modeling the flow of carbon through a forest, well, basically a tree in a forest here, and looking at modeling the carbon that's in the leaves, the woody stem, the roots, the litter, and the soil organic matter, and the amount of carbon in each of these boxes, and then the flux or the movement from one box to the next. And you can write down that particular model as if it's a matrix model. So for those of you that might be interested or are familiar with like Leslie population dynamics models, this is very much looking like a Leslie type of matrix here. And then these were the kind of results that they got from fitting that model. This was showing the dynamics of the carbon levels in different parts of the tree and in the soil as well. And these models in particular were fit using what's called Markov chain Monte Carlo, which would be the next thing I talk about here. So, okay, so it's, in a sense, it's relatively easy to formulate a state space model. It's the fitting that's really the hardest part. And when you're doing fitting, there's two things that you do. Two kinds of inference that you make. You make inference about the parameters of the state model and the observation model. And sometimes that's what's of primary interest. But at other times, you're interested in what are the actual state values. So for example, when you build a state space model for harvested species, you'd like to know, let's say like fisheries, you'd like to know, well, how many fish are still out there at some point in the season, because that's going to affect, say, what the harvest levels ought to be. So there's, depending on the problem situation, there's going to be interest in the parameters or interest in the states themselves. Now, these models can be fit using frequentist or Bayesian approaches. The initial work that was done for when the models came out in the early 60s, really for 30 years, the 60s, the 70s, and 80s, almost everybody fit state space models with a frequentist approach, so finding maximum likelihood estimates. And then in the 90s, when computers were faster and equally important, Markov chain Monte Carlo became well known and popular. Bayesian approaches have become very common as well. And you can classify the fitting methods into three groups. There's the analytic, what you call closed form exact answers. There are approximate methods, and then there's simulation-based solutions. So the Markov chain Monte Carlo, for example, falls into that latter group. And then there's an increasing amount of and types of different software for fitting these models as well. So for both Bayesian inference and frequentist inference, what's central to doing inference is calculating the marginal likelihood. In other words, calculating the probability density just for the observations alone. So that involves integrating out the state values. And that's what's been sort of the hard part, or can be the hard part of fitting state space models, is doing this integration here. Now, for frequentists, once they calculate that marginal likelihood, then they can calculate maximum likelihood estimates for the parameters. And then to calculate what the states are, they typically calculate the expected value of the states given parameter estimates. So there's a two-step approach to inference. Whereas the Bayesians handle everything simultaneously. They'll postulate priors for the parameters, and implicitly they specify priors for the states, but that's just coming from the state process model. But then the end result is you come up with a posterior distribution for both the states and the parameters simultaneously. So for analytic closed form solutions, for these linear Gaussian state space models, again, these sort of the original state space models, and for hidden Markov models, there are exact analytic solutions. A lot of you have probably heard of like the Kalman filter. That's a tool for basically yielding that marginal distribution for the data. And with hidden Markov models, it's a matter of summing across all the states to come up with that marginal distribution. So that's those two kinds of special cases of state space models have these really nice, convenient fitting approaches. Now for other kinds of state space models, some of the early extensions were to linearize the model, sort of kind of shoehorn the model into a linear framework, and that led to what's called the extended Kalman filter. And for example, that was the tool that was used back in the mid-60s to help during the Apollo mission to keep the Apollo spacecraft on track with their target being to land on the moon. So there was an immediate practical application of state space models back then. Another approximate solution is to use what's called Laplace approximation. And that, in a way, that's kind of, again, sort of shoehorning or fitting your model into a normal framework. But now, what perhaps you might say most people do nowadays are simulation-based, and there's one of the reasons for it is that you don't have to specify near so many constraints upon your model. There's a lot more flexibility as the type of model that you fit. And the other reason is that there's a lot more tools out there now. And here I've listed some of the most common approaches to fitting state space models now with simulation techniques. So originally people were doing Markov chain Monte Carlo techniques for Bayesian inference. And then it was discovered, let's say, in the early 2000s that those same techniques could be used to fit the models in a frequentist framework, and that was called data cloning. And then also sort of late 90s, early 2000, a similar technique to MCMC called Hamiltonian Monte Carlo came online. And now there's a package called STAN that does this kind of inference for you. And then some people argue that sequential Monte Carlo is sort of the best way now, overall best way of fitting state space models of any length. So one of the things I'm not going into details here, but some of these techniques really kind of, I won't say they fall apart, but they become very cumbersome with very long time series. And they're sort of what you call offline problems. Like you can, if you have your data in hand, you've got plenty of time to fit the model, that's fine. But if you've got data that's coming in, say, daily, then those techniques don't work near as well. These sequential methods work. And there's both frequentist methods and Bayesian methods here. And then people have started mixing these techniques together. And then there are other, down at the bottom here, these likelihood-free methods, which I want to mention here. So what's another feature of these models is now that it's really easy to specify an overly complex state space model once you start really writing down all the processes to get to the point where you really can't write down the probability distribution function for the state process. It'll involve convolutions or additions or of random variables or random variables that are functions of other random variables, and it quickly gets out of hand. Now you can't write it down analytically, but you can usually simulate from that process, and that leads to a class of techniques that some are calling plug and play techniques, and that's the basis for iterated filtering, and it's also the basis for these what are called likelihood-free methods, approximate Bayesian computation, and synthetic likelihood. So this is really powerful now in the sense of freeing up, say, the model formulator even more. Now here's an example I want to mention. This was some work that David Borchers and I did several years ago. And the point of this example is to show what a difference it made to fit this data using a state space model and accounting for both kinds of data in contrast to non-state space model. So these were data that were coming from, these were counts or estimates of eastern North Pacific gray whales based upon observations, shoreline observations. And these results were from these sample surveys across time. Now, the original fitting of this model was done in a non-state space manner, where they basically specified that the abundance of whales at time t is a function of the abundance of whales at time t minus 1. And they wrote like a Leslie matrix that included birth and aging and survival. That's what here. And then there's harvest as well. And they had this relatively complex process model underneath it all. And so, but they didn't have any observation error built into that. Okay, so it's purely state process dynamics. And we fit a state space model, a linear Gaussian state space model, to these data as well. And this was actually really gratifying work. We saw significant differences between the state space model and the non-state space model. Here's some examples here that without accounting for observation error, the estimated juvenile survival, this phi j, was nearly 100%, which didn't make any sense. And it was also greater than the adult survival, which is 94%. So that was without accounting for observation error. But when we plugged in accounted for observation error, the juvenile survival dropped down to about 83%, and adult survival went up a little bit. But the main point here was that juvenile survival dropped off, which made more biological sense. Then these other terms here relate to the fecundity of the whales, and these results made a difference as well. And in the original non-state space formulation, they had this sort of additional noise that was added in, they kind of a fudge factor, they called it. This was the variation that they couldn't account for in their model. And so this was the variance term too. Now, when we accounted for observation error in the state space model, that additional sort of fudge factor dropped off a lot, significantly. And this was the reflection of the fact that we're sort of better accounting for the unexplained variation by having a separate observation model. And this is just a picture of projections of the observations of the red triangles, and the blue plus signs were the fits from the state space model, and then the blue X's were the results from the model without any observation error. And the models were diverged in early years, but as more data were collected, the two models kind of tended to overlap. And so in conclusion, I have not talked about everything that you can talk about with state space models, and I just want to mention some things that I've left out. Haven't mentioned anything about model diagnostics, goodness of fit, doing outlier detection. Haven't mentioned model comparison and selection. And I haven't mentioned the problem of when you formulate a state space model that's way too complex for the data. And I'm just raising these points to say that these are issues that have been addressed, but there's still open problems in that area. And last slide of material here, just want to point out again that state space models are useful for anything that's got a time series that has an underlying Markov process to it. And I did a Google search a few days ago, just searching on agricultural science and state space models. And these three examples came up here. And I just want to point out this last example here. This was the use of drones in precision agriculture and how state space models are being used in that area as well. And then here's my last slide with references to some of the work mentioned here. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Ken.
There
Great talk. Yeah. Do we have any questions? Mark's got a question, I think.
Thanks, Ken. Just I wondered if you could say something a bit more about model diagnostics. I mean, I'm a big one for what you said about the model being more biologically realistic, because that obviously is important. But is there a signal or in the data above and beyond sort of scatterplot that you showed that could lead you towards the conclusion that it's a better model, a more appropriate model?
Right. There's been some really nice work done in the last 3 or 4 years about probability integral transform residuals. So you want to use sort of one step ahead residuals with state space models. And recent work, well, it's basically, David Wharton did some work with what he calls pit residuals or pit transforms, probability interval transform actually. And that work has been translated now into state space models. And it is, so it's a way of identifying when you're starting to go astray, for example. There's also some work that's been discussed about even, how do you define residuals for the state process when you don't even observe them? But there's work that's going on there as well. But those are probably two of the most common approaches. And for example, within the program Template Model Builder, which uses Laplace approximation, that is now sort of a built-in operation for detecting outliers.
Thanks, Ken. I think Joe's got a question, Glenn.
Yeah, thanks. Do you want to ask it, Joe? Or?
You mentioned at the end non-identifiable status models, and I'm just wondering what thoughts you had on that. I mean, whether there's really much you can do other than just try to simplify it. And yeah.
Yeah. Well, Diana Cole in particular, building upon some earlier work from Byron Morgan and Ted Catchpole, has developed a lot of sort of symbolic algebra machinery now for determining what is identifiable and what is not. And there's a really nice 2016 paper by her and Rachel McCrae where they particularly focus on determining non-identifiability in state space models specifically. And what comes out of that is that you'll see, that you can't separately estimate, say, fecundity from first-year survival in an animal population. And so the first thing is to recognize that you have that problem in an analytical way. Now, you can either sort of live with it, which means probably therefore, simplifying your model or just recognizing you've got that dependency going on, or it guides you to collecting different kinds of data that you're going to have to collect sort of separate information on fecundity. So it's then to be able to separate that out, say, from first year survival. So it can change your monitoring program. You may have to start sampling at a higher frequency or at different points in, say, the life cycle of an animal. So, but the point number one, I think, is, well, do we have a problem in detecting it? Because it's with these complicated models, you may not even know that you have non-identifiability if you have lots of parameters. So there are now tools in place to help you determine what's identifiable and what's not identifiable. And then the second thing, well, I've identified it. Now what do I do about it? I've either got to change my model or I'm going to have to start collecting different kinds of data to fill in those gaps.
So, Ken, this is maybe more of a comment than a question, but my question is about discrete versus continuous time. So I was just wondering what kind of the balance is in the state-space modeling community between those.
Right. There's, particularly in the movement modeling world, there's a lot. That's where a lot of people, like Paul Blackwell in particular, comes to mind, who's done a lot of work with continuous time state-space models, where you're observing the animals just whenever you happen to detect them. So it's not at fixed points in time. And Devin Johnson did a lot of work back in about 2006 with seals, where he was writing down, if I remember right, it's like I think Ornstein-Uhlenbeck processes, I believe it was called, to reflect the process portion anyway of the model. So so both of those approaches are sort of proceeding in parallel. more people are doing the discrete time because they're more familiar with it. But
yeah.
yeah, that's sort of the status of it.
So, and the comment, I guess, was just that, I think there's quite a lot of work that's done in epidemiology in terms of fitting models, which are essentially state-based models. And, for example, in terms of model diagnostics, Max Lau developed some model residual ideas, latent residual ideas, where you kind of infer the residual and then test them. And that might be something that could be interesting to talk about. Very quickly, I think, Adam, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was interested in the Wales example, but how different the SSM and non-SSM were. I just wondered, does that have any implications for how sensitive the models are to misspecification, particularly of the observation model part?
So like if you specified sort of a really poor observation model, say, and
yeah. Well, I guess just how crucial are the assumptions underpinning the observation model to sort of the SSM output?
I think it varies a lot. I can't really give a generic answer. I mean, sort of the obvious thing to do is, well, you try multiple observation models and see how much effect it has on the parameters of interest. So, with count data, for example, you could say, well, I'm going to try Poisson, or I'm going to try negative binomial, or I'm going to try just in general some sort of over dispersed count data model. And does that have much effect on my estimates of process parameters or estimates of underlying states? So yeah, it's going to vary for sure.
Great, thank you. Given the time, I think we should firstly thank Ken and Adam and Claire for their great talks in our first session. So thank you.